Picture this: a castle perched on a cliff in the Carpathian Mountains. The year is 1897, but the stones beneath your feet remember centuries of blood. The wind howls through broken windows, like the breath of something that refuses to die. You stand in the great hall, where torches cast shadows that move with lives of their own. This is where the nightmare begins. This is where fiction and history collide in ways that will haunt you long after you close your eyes tonight. You know this place, don't you? You've seen it in 100 films, read about it in countless books. The castle of Count Dracula, the undead nobleman who sleeps in a coffin by day and hunts by night. The pale aristocrat with hypnotic eyes who seduces his victims before drinking their blood. The immortal monster who can transform into a bat, a wolf, or mist itself. This is the Dracula of popular imagination, the vampire king who has terrified and fascinated audiences since Bram Stoker published his novel in 1897. But let me tell you something that will change how you see this story forever. This is not a tale about a supernatural creature cursed to walk the earth for eternity. This is not a gothic romance about forbidden desire and eternal damnation. This is the story of how a 15th-century prince became the blueprint for humanity's most enduring monster. And the truth is far more disturbing than any vampire legend, because the real horror was never fangs or immortality. It was what one man did to other men in the name of power, survival, and a twisted vision of justice. The castle you're standing in exists. Not this exact fortress, perhaps, but castles like it dot the landscape of Transylvania and Wallachia. They were built as fortifications against endless invasions, as symbols of authority over territories constantly contested by empires. In the 15th century, this region was a blood-soaked chessboard where the Ottoman Empire, the Kingdom of Hungary, and dozens of smaller principalities played a game with human lives as pieces. To rule here required more than strength. It required a willingness to inspire absolute terror. Before we descend deeper into this history, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark chapters from our past deserve to be remembered, if you think the line between man and monster is worth examining, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps the candle burning in the archives of forgotten history. It allows us to keep exploring the shadows that shaped our collective nightmares. Now, let me tell you about the man behind the myth. His name was Vlad the Third, Prince of Wallachia, ruler of a small principality squeezed between Christian Europe and the expanding Ottoman Empire. History gave him many names. His subjects called him Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, a title inherited from his father who belonged to the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric society dedicated to defending Christianity. His enemies called him something else entirely. They called him Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler. That name tells you everything you need to know about how he ruled and why his story became legend. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand the world that created him. Imagine living in 15th century Eastern Europe. Your life expectancy is perhaps 35 years if you're lucky. War is not an occasional catastrophe. It's the permanent condition of existence. Armies march through your village every few years, each one claiming to represent God or empire or the natural order. They take your food, your livestock, your children. If you resist, you die. If you comply, you die more slowly. The Ottoman Empire is expanding westward with the momentum of destiny itself. They've already conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending 1,000 years of Byzantine civilization in a siege that shocked Christian Europe to its core. Now they're pushing into the Balkans, converting or destroying everything in their path. The Hungarian kingdom to the north is the last major Christian power capable of resisting. But Hungary has its own internal struggles, its own ambitions. Wallachia sits between these two titans, like a mouse between two fighting bears. To survive as a prince in this world requires impossible calculations. Pledge loyalty to the Ottomans, and you become a vassal state paying tribute in gold and blood. Your people's children are taken as janissaries, converted to Islam, and trained to fight for the Sultan. Pledge loyalty to Hungary, and you invite Ottoman invasion. Stay neutral, and both empires crush you for your insolence. There is no good choice. There is only survival measured in years, sometimes only months. This is the world Vlad inherited, not once, but 3 times. His reign was interrupted twice by exile and warfare, forcing him to reclaim his throne through blood each time. And each time he returned, he became more ruthless, more willing to use methods that would make even hardened warriors turn away in horror. But here's what you must understand. In his time, in his place, he was not unique in his brutality. What made Vlad different was the scale, the consistency, and most importantly, the propaganda. Yes, propaganda. Because much of what we know about Vlad the Impaler comes from pamphlets printed in German territories after his death. These were the first mass-produced horror stories, bestsellers of their era that painted Vlad as a sadistic monster who tortured and killed for pleasure. They described methods of execution and punishment that seemed to come from the imagination of demons. These pamphlets were printed by the thousands and distributed across Europe. They were the viral content of the late 15th century. But who commissioned these pamphlets? Who benefited from portraying Vlad as a monster? His enemies, of course. The Saxon merchants he had impaled for economic crimes. The Hungarian king who saw him as a threat. The Ottoman Sultan who wanted to justify military campaigns against Wallachia. Political enemies have always understood that destroying a man's reputation can be more effective than destroying the man himself. When you can't defeat someone in battle, you defeat him in the collective imagination. So here's the question we must ask as we begin this journey. Was Vlad Dracula truly a monster? Or was he a ruler using the brutal tools of his brutal age, later transformed into a monster by his enemies' propaganda? The answer is complex. The answer is uncomfortable. The answer is that he was both. And understanding how those two truths can exist simultaneously is what makes his story so haunting. Because here's the terrible reality. Vlad did use extreme methods of punishment and political terror. The historical evidence is clear even when we strip away the exaggerations and propaganda. But he also defended a small Christian principality against overwhelming odds. He maintained a brutal form of order in a land where chaos meant death for thousands. He became a folk hero to his own people, even as his enemies painted him as evil incarnate. He was a man shaped by trauma, by political necessity, by the logic of survival in an age when mercy was often indistinguishable from weakness. And somehow, 400 years after his death, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker found these stories and saw in them the perfect foundation for a new kind of monster. A monster that would transcend its historical origins to become immortal in ways the real Vlad never imagined. The vampire, the undead aristocrat, the creature that feeds on the living to sustain its own dark existence. The castle still stands in the mountains, though tourists walk through it now with cameras instead of torches. The stones remember nothing. The wind is just wind. But the story persists because something in Vlad's tale speaks to our deepest fears about power, about what humans become when survival demands the unthinkable. The vampire is eternal because the question at its heart is eternal. What separates the monster from the man? And how thin is that line when darkness falls? Welcome to the story of Dracula. Not the vampire, the prince, not the legend, the man, and the terrible journey from one to the other. The name appears in documents dated 1431, written in the careful script of clerks who had no idea they were recording the birth of a legend. Vlad, son of Vlad the Second, who had just been inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a prestigious chivalric society founded by Sigismund of Hungary to defend Christendom against Ottoman expansion. The father took the name Dracula, meaning dragon, a badge of honor that connected him to the most powerful Christian rulers of his age. The son would inherit that name with a slight modification: Dracula, son of the dragon. But there's something you need to know about the Romanian language. The word Dracul has two meanings. Dragon, yes, but also devil. This linguistic duality would follow Vlad throughout his life and beyond. A name that could be read as both noble and demonic, depending on who was speaking and what they wanted others to believe. When his enemies later printed pamphlets about his cruelty, they didn't need to invent a sinister name. They simply emphasized the other meaning already embedded in the syllables he'd carried since birth. To understand Vlad, you must first understand Wallachia. Close your eyes and picture a land that exists more as a concept than a country. It's 1431, and this principality is barely a century old, carved out of territory between the Danube River and the Carpathian Mountains. To the south lies the Ottoman Empire, growing stronger with each passing year. To the north and west lies the Kingdom of Hungary, the last major Christian power in the region. To the east lies Moldavia, another small principality playing the same dangerous game of survival. Wallachia has no natural borders that can be easily defended. It has no great cities that can withstand prolonged sieges. What it has is strategic importance far beyond its size. Control Wallachia, and you control the roads between Constantinople and Central Europe. Control Wallachia, and you control river crossings, mountain passes, and trade routes that connect empires. This makes the principality valuable. It also makes it a target. The princes of Wallachia rule not by hereditary right, but by a combination of political maneuvering, military strength, and the tolerance of more powerful neighbors. The throne is not inherited peacefully from father to son. It is seized, lost, and seized again in endless cycles of violence. A prince might rule for a few years before being overthrown by a rival, backed by Hungary or the Ottomans. The average reign lasts perhaps 5 years. Some last only months. Vlad II understood this brutal political reality better than most. He spent his reign trying to balance the impossible demands of his more powerful neighbors. Pay tribute to the Ottomans to avoid invasion. Accept Hungarian influence to maintain legitimacy. Switch sides when necessary to survive. This was not cowardice. This was statecraft in an age when one wrong decision meant death for yourself and devastation for your people. But in 1442, Vlad II made a calculation that would haunt his family for generations. The Ottoman Sultan Murad II invited him to a meeting to discuss their alliance. Vlad brought his 2 younger sons, 11-year-old Vlad the Third and 7-year-old Radu. It was meant to be a diplomatic visit. It became a hostage situation. The Ottomans did not imprison the boys in dungeons or torture chambers. They were given rooms in the palace, educated by tutors, trained in horsemanship and warfare alongside the sons of Ottoman nobility. This was not cruelty. This was standard Ottoman practice for securing the loyalty of vassal rulers. Keep the sons of tributary princes as honored guests, and the fathers will think twice before rebellion. Educate them in Ottoman ways, and they might rule their homelands as loyal vassals when they eventually return. But imagine being 11 years old and understanding that you are simultaneously a guest and a prisoner. You live in luxury, but you cannot leave. Your teachers are kind, but they serve the empire that holds your father in fear. Your companions are friendly, but their fathers conquered your homeland. Every lesson you learn comes with an unspoken threat. Your life depends on your father's obedience. One act of defiance by Vlad II, and his sons would disappear into the darkness of Ottoman dungeons or worse. Young Vlad spent 6 years in this gilded cage. 6 formative years when other boys his age were learning to rule their own lands, building alliances, understanding their people. Instead, he learned the intricacies of Ottoman court politics, the efficiency of their military machine, and the methods they used to control conquered territories. He watched how they dealt with rebellion. He saw what happened to princes who forgot their place in the imperial order. And he learned to hate, not the mindless hate of ignorance, but the cold, calculated hatred of someone who understands exactly how power works and what it costs to be powerless. The Ottomans gave Vlad an education they would later regret. They taught him that loyalty secured through fear is the strongest loyalty. They taught him that mercy is a luxury only the powerful can afford. They taught him that survival requires a willingness to do whatever circumstances demand. While Vlad was learning these lessons in Ottoman territory, his father was trying to navigate the increasingly impossible demands of his position. In 1447, political enemies backed by the Hungarian regent John Hunyadi orchestrated a coup. Vlad II was captured along with his eldest son, Mircea. What happened next set a template for the violence that would define the region for decades. Vlad II was buried alive. Mircea was tortured and burned alive after having his eyes removed with hot iron stakes. The news reached young Vlad in Ottoman captivity. His father was dead. His eldest brother was dead. His younger brother Radu had adapted to Ottoman life so completely that he would later fight for the Sultan against his own homeland. And Vlad himself was still a hostage, now the only surviving legitimate heir to a throne held by his father's murderers. He was 17 years old. The Ottomans saw an opportunity. They had educated a prince who now had every reason to hate the Hungarian-backed rivals ruling Wallachia. They released him with Ottoman military support to reclaim his throne. In 1448, Vlad the Third became Prince of Wallachia for the first time. His reign lasted 2 months before Hungarian forces drove him into exile again. 2 months. Just enough time to understand what power felt like and to lose it again. Just enough time to make enemies who would remember his name. Just enough time to realize that if he ever got another chance to rule, he would need to be far more ruthless than his father ever dared to be. Vlad spent the next 8 years in exile, moving between courts, making alliances, waiting. During these years, the Ottoman Empire continued its expansion. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire and sending shockwaves through Christian Europe. The fall of the great city was not just a military defeat. It was the end of an era. The destruction of a civilization that had stood for over 1,000 years. It proved that no Christian kingdom was safe from Ottoman ambition. The conquest changed everything. The Ottomans were no longer a powerful neighbor to be managed through diplomacy and tribute. They were an existential threat demanding complete submission or total resistance. There was no middle ground anymore. No room for the careful balancing act that previous Wallachian princes had performed. The question facing any ruler in the region was simple: submit or fight. And if you choose to fight, understand that you're choosing a war where mercy is a forgotten concept and victory requires methods that will make your name synonymous with terror. In 1456, Vlad got his second chance. With Hungarian support this time, he reclaimed the Wallachian throne. He was 25 years old. He had spent 6 years as an Ottoman hostage, watched his father and brother murdered by political enemies, ruled for 2 months before being driven into exile, and spent nearly a decade waiting for another opportunity. Every lesson he had learned, every trauma he had endured, every moment of powerlessness he had suffered, was about to find expression in a reign that would make his name immortal. This time, he would not rule for 2 months. This time, he would make sure that everyone, friend and enemy alike, understood exactly what it meant to threaten his power. This time, he would use methods so terrible that 5 centuries later, people would struggle to believe one man could be responsible for such systematic brutality. The name written in blood was about to be written across the landscape of Wallachia in ways that would echo through history as something more than human, something monstrous. To understand the monster, you must first understand the boy. Not the legend, not the propaganda, but the child who would become Vlad the Third. He was born in 1431 in Sighisoara, a fortified town in Transylvania where his father ruled as military governor. His early childhood was spent in relative security, the son of a prince who belonged to an elite order of Christian knights. He learned to ride horses, to handle weapons, to read and write in an age when literacy was a privilege of the nobility. For the first 11 years of his life, his future seemed clear. He would grow up to be a prince, a warrior, a defender of Christendom like his father. Then, everything changed. In 1442, his father made the journey to meet Sultan Murad II, taking young Vlad and his brother Radu with him. The meeting was cordial. The Sultan was gracious. And when it was time to leave, Vlad II went home alone. His sons stayed behind as insurance for his continued loyalty. They were 11 and 7 years old. Imagine that moment of realization. Your father is leaving. You're staying in a foreign land among people who speak a different language, practice a different faith, and represent everything your family has sworn to fight against. You're told it's an honor, that you'll receive an education fit for a prince. But you understand the truth. You're a hostage. Your life is collateral for your father's obedience. One wrong move by him, and you disappear. The Ottoman palace was not a dungeon, but it was a prison nonetheless. Vlad and Radu lived in comfortable quarters, ate fine food, and were educated by some of the best tutors in the empire. They learned Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They studied the Quran alongside military strategy and horsemanship. They were trained to fight in the Ottoman style, to understand Ottoman politics, to see the world through the lens of an empire that measured success in conquered territories and subjected peoples. But the education came with constant reminders of their powerlessness. Other hostage princes surrounded them, sons of rulers from the Balkans to the Caucasus, all held as guarantees of their father's loyalty. Some of these boys adapted, converted to Islam, and eventually served the Sultan loyally. Others resisted and vanished into the darker corners of the palace system. The message was clear. You can thrive here if you submit completely, or you can disappear if you resist. There is no third option. Vlad's younger brother Radu chose adaptation. He was 7 when they arrived, young enough to forget his homeland and embrace his new life. He became a favorite at court, known for his beauty and his willingness to assimilate into Ottoman culture. Later, he would fight for the Sultan against his own brother. But Vlad was different. Vlad was 11, old enough to remember who he was supposed to be, old enough to understand that submission meant betraying everything his father's Order of the Dragon represented. The records from this period are sparse, but we know certain facts. Vlad was a difficult student, prone to anger and defiance. He was punished repeatedly for his resistance to Ottoman authority. These weren't gentle corrections. The Ottomans used physical punishment to break the will of stubborn hostages. Young Vlad learned what it felt like to be powerless, to have no control over his own body or fate. He learned that the world belonged to those strong enough to take it and keep it through fear. During those 6 years of captivity, something crystallized in Vlad's mind. A cold understanding of how power actually works, stripped of the chivalric codes and Christian virtues his father had taught him. Power isn't about nobility or divine right. Power is about the willingness to do what your enemies cannot stomach. Power is about making people so afraid of you that they obey before you even give the order. The Ottomans taught him this. They just didn't realize they were creating their own future enemy. Then came the news that shattered whatever remained of his childhood. 1447. A messenger arrived at the Ottoman court with reports from Wallachia. There had been a coup. Hungarian forces backing rival claimants to the throne had captured Vlad's father and eldest brother Mircea. What happened next was designed to send a message to anyone who might challenge Hungarian influence in the region. Vlad the Second was forced to dig his own grave. Then he was buried alive, dirt piled on him while he could still breathe, suffocating slowly in the darkness. His son Mircea suffered worse. He was blinded with hot iron stakes, then tortured for hours before being burned alive. The cruelty wasn't random. It was calculated political theater meant to demonstrate what happened to princes who failed to serve Hungarian interests. Vlad heard these details while still a hostage in Ottoman territory. He was 17 years old. His father was dead. His eldest brother was dead. His younger brother had essentially become Ottoman. And he was alone, the only surviving legitimate heir to a throne now occupied by his family's murderers. The boy who had entered Ottoman captivity at 11 left it at 17 transformed into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The Ottomans released him with military support, seeing an opportunity to install a prince who owed his throne to them. In 1448, Vlad entered Wallachia at the head of an Ottoman army. He was crowned Prince of Wallachia. He ruled for exactly 2 months before Hungarian forces supporting rival claimants drove him out again. 2 months to taste power and lose it. 2 months to understand that everything he had endured, everything he had survived, could be taken away by enemies who were stronger and better connected. The next 8 years were exile and waiting. Vlad moved between courts, seeking allies, making promises, biding his time. He watched the world change around him. In 1453, the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, the great Christian capital that had stood for over 1,000 years. The city fell after a brutal siege. The last Byzantine emperor died fighting on the walls. The great churches were converted into mosques. 1,000 years of Christian civilization in the East died in smoke and blood. The message was clear to every Christian ruler in Eastern Europe. The Ottomans were unstoppable, and the only question was how long you could delay your inevitable submission. Some princes chose to become vassals immediately, paying tribute and sending their sons as hostages. Others tried to resist and were crushed. The middle ground was disappearing. Soon there would only be those who submitted and those who fought to the death. Vlad watched all of this from exile, learning, calculating, preparing. He had spent 6 years as a hostage learning Ottoman methods. He had ruled for 2 months and lost everything. He had spent 8 years in exile, understanding that power in this world belonged to those willing to be more ruthless than their enemies could imagine. When his opportunity came again, he would not make the mistakes of mercy or moderation that had destroyed his father. In 1456, political circumstances aligned in his favor. The Hungarian regent John Hunyadi, who had orchestrated his father's murder, was dead. New powers in Hungary saw Vlad as a useful tool against Ottoman expansion. With Hungarian military support, Vlad marched into Wallachia for the second time. He was 25 years old. He had been shaped by betrayal, trauma, captivity, and exile. He had learned lessons about power that most princes never fully understand. This time, when he took the throne, he understood exactly what he needed to do to keep it. The boy who had entered Ottoman captivity, believing in chivalry and Christian virtue, was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned that survival requires absolute ruthlessness. A man who understood that terror is the most efficient form of control. A man who was about to demonstrate that there are fates worse than death, and that a ruler willing to inflict them can achieve a kind of power that transcends military strength. The making of the monster was complete. What came next would be the demonstration of everything those formative years had taught him, and the world would never forget. 1456. Vlad the Third enters his capital city of Targoviste at the head of an army. He is 25 years old, and this is his second coronation. The first one lasted 2 months before his enemies drove him into exile. This time will be different. This time, he has learned the lessons that only trauma and powerlessness can teach. This time, he understands that a prince who wants to keep his throne must make his subjects more afraid of him than they are of his enemies. The first thing Vlad did was eliminate his rivals. Not in secret, not through quiet assassinations that might be denied later. He gathered the boyars, the noble families who had supported previous claimants to the throne, who had conspired with his father's murderers, who had grown rich and comfortable playing both sides of every conflict. He invited them to an Easter feast at his palace in Targoviste. They came dressed in their finest clothes, expecting to negotiate their positions under the new prince. Instead, Vlad asked them a question. He wanted to know how many princes they had seen come and go in their lifetimes. The older boyars boasted of the number, some claiming to have served under 7 or more different rulers. They thought they were demonstrating their experience and political survival skills. They didn't realize they were signing their own death warrants. Vlad saw their answer as a confession. They were the reason Wallachia had no stability, the reason princes rose and fell like seasons, the reason his father had been murdered and he himself had been driven into exile after 2 months. What happened next became legend, though the details are disputed. The accounts agree on the essential facts. Vlad arrested the boyars and their families. The older nobles, those who had admitted to serving many princes, faced immediate execution through terrible methods meant to serve as public warnings. The younger, Healthier ones were forced to march over 50 miles to the ruins of a fortress in the mountains. There, they were put to work rebuilding the fortification that would become known as Poenari Castle, Vlad's mountain retreat. They worked until their fine clothes fell apart, until their hands bled, until exhaustion and despair claimed most of them. This was not random cruelty. This was calculated political surgery. In one action, Vlad eliminated the noble families most likely to betray him, sent a message about the cost of disloyalty, and built a fortress that would serve as his stronghold in times of crisis. Every element served multiple purposes. Every act of violence was also an act of statecraft. The boyar class that had played kingmaker for generations suddenly understood that the game had changed. But Vlad's methods extended far beyond eliminating his immediate political rivals. He implemented a system of law enforcement that was brutal but effective. Theft became a death sentence. Lying became a death sentence. Adultery, laziness, and even minor infractions could result in terrible punishments designed to maximize both suffering and public visibility. The message was clear. In Vlad's Wallachia, there was no such thing as a minor crime. Every violation of order would be met with overwhelming force. Historical accounts, many written by his enemies, describe public executions that became spectacles of state power. The methods varied, but they shared a common purpose: to create such fear that obedience became instinctive rather than calculated. Vlad didn't want subjects who weighed their options and chose loyalty. He wanted subjects who couldn't imagine any option except loyalty, because the alternative was literally unthinkable. And here's where the propaganda becomes difficult to separate from the reality. The German pamphlets printed after his death describe scenes of systematic cruelty that seemed designed to shock rather than inform. They were bestsellers of their era, printed by the thousands and distributed across Europe. They painted Vlad as a sadistic monster who tortured and killed for pleasure, who ate meals surrounded by the dying, who invented new methods of torment for his own amusement. But who commissioned these pamphlets? The Saxon merchants of Transylvania, whom Vlad had punished for economic crimes against Wallachian traders? The Hungarian court, which saw Vlad as a useful tool who had become dangerously independent. Later, the Ottoman Empire, which needed to justify military campaigns against a small Christian principality. Every one of his enemies had reasons to exaggerate his cruelty, to transform a brutal but effective ruler into a monster beyond redemption. Yet even accounting for propaganda and exaggeration, the historical evidence is clear. Vlad did use extreme methods of punishment and political terror. The question is not whether he did these things, but why. Was he a sadistic monster who enjoyed suffering? Or was he a ruler using the brutal tools available to him in a brutal age? The answer matters because it determines whether we're looking at evil incarnate or at the logic of political survival, taken to its darkest extreme. Consider the context. Wallachia in 1456 was not a stable kingdom with established institutions and peaceful succession. It was a war-torn borderland where the average prince ruled for less than 5 years before being overthrown or killed. Vlad's father had been buried alive. His brother had been tortured to death. He himself had lost his throne after 2 months. In this environment, the traditional virtues of mercy and forgiveness were not noble ideals. They were invitations to be overthrown. Vlad's methods achieved something remarkable: stability. For 6 years, from 1456 to 1462, Wallachia had internal peace. Crime rates dropped to near zero because everyone understood the consequences of breaking the law. The boyar class, traditionally the source of political instability, was too terrified to plot against him. Merchants could travel the roads without fear of bandits. The economy grew because people knew the rules and knew that breaking them meant certain death. Was this peace worth the cost? That's not a question history can answer objectively. What we know is that Vlad's subjects had complex feelings about him. The Romanian folk traditions that survived for centuries after his death paint him not as a monster, but as a harsh but fair ruler who protected the weak against the powerful. The stories emphasize his intolerance for corruption and theft, his defense of Wallachia against impossible odds, his willingness to punish the wealthy and privileged as harshly as the poor. But his external enemies saw something else entirely. The Ottomans saw a vassal who had refused his proper place in the imperial order. The Saxons saw a prince who didn't respect their traditional economic privileges. The Hungarian court saw a client who had become too independent. And all of them saw an opportunity to destroy his reputation as completely as they hoped to destroy his rule. In 1462, after a series of military campaigns against Ottoman forces that achieved surprising success, Vlad faced a massive Ottoman invasion led by his own brother Radu. The Sultan himself, Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, marched into Wallachia with an army that outnumbered Vlad's forces by at least 10-1. The campaign should have been a quick victory for the Ottomans. Instead, Vlad turned it into a nightmare. He implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying his own villages and poisoning wells rather than let them supply the Ottoman army. He used guerrilla tactics, night raids, and psychological warfare to harass the invaders. And he created scenes of such horror that even the battle-hardened Ottoman soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns, were shaken. The Sultan himself, after marching through a landscape devastated by Vlad's defensive strategy, turned back rather than continue deeper into Wallachia. But Vlad couldn't win through military means alone. The Ottomans installed his brother Radu as a rival prince, and Hungarian support, which had been unreliable throughout his reign, finally vanished completely. In 1462, Vlad was captured by Hungarian forces and imprisoned. He would spend the next 12 years in captivity, watching while others ruled the principality he had fought so hard to control. The Prince of Shadows had fallen, but the shadow he cast would grow longer with each passing year. The propaganda pamphlets continued to circulate, each printing adding new horrors to his legend. The stories spread across Europe, transforming a 15th-century ruler into something that transcended history. 400 years later, a writer in Ireland would find these stories and see in them the perfect foundation for a new kind of monster. Not the man anymore, the myth. Vlad was not alone in the darkness. While his story provided the name and the historical framework for Dracula, the vampire legend drew from deeper wells of human fear. Across Eastern Europe, from the Carpathian Mountains to the Balkans, stories of the undead had existed for centuries before Bram Stoker ever put pen to paper. These were not literary inventions. These were survival mechanisms, ways for terrified populations to explain the inexplicable horrors of medieval life. Picture a village in 16th-century Transylvania. Winter has arrived early, and with it comes plague. People go to sleep healthy and wake with fever. By evening, they're dead. By the next morning, 3 more families show the same symptoms. Within a week, a quarter of the village is buried in frozen ground. The survivors don't understand germ theory or disease vectors. They only know that death is spreading like a living thing, and it seems to prefer certain families, certain houses, as if something is choosing its victims. In this environment of terror and ignorance, the vampire myth makes perfect sense. The first person who died must have become something unnatural, something that returns from the grave to feed on the living. The family members who sicken and die are not victims of contagion, but victims of the undead creature's hunger. This explanation gives form to the formless threat. It transforms random tragedy into something that can be understood and potentially stopped. The folklore remedies followed logically from this belief. If the dead are rising to feed on the living, then you must make sure they stay dead. Bury them face down so they dig deeper instead of up. Place stones in their mouths so they cannot bite. Drive stakes through their hearts to pin them to the earth. These practices were not superstition in the abstract. They were public health measures based on the best understanding available to people living in constant proximity to death. But the vampire myth didn't spring only from plague and disease. It came from a much older fear, one that exists in almost every culture: the fear of being buried alive. In an age before modern medicine, before reliable methods of confirming death, this was not paranoia, but reasonable concern. People fell into comas that mimicked death. They suffered from catalepsy, from severe hypothermia, from conditions that slowed their heartbeat and breathing to barely detectable levels. Imagine waking in absolute darkness, your hands pressed against wood inches from your face. You try to move and realize you're trapped in a coffin, buried under 6 feet of earth. You scream, but no one hears. You claw at the wood until your fingers break and bleed. And eventually, your air runs out. This nightmare happened often enough in medieval Europe that wealthy families installed bells in their crypts, connected by strings to the hands of the corpse, just in case. The fear of premature burial merged with observations of decomposition to create vampire legends. Bodies buried in shallow graves or in conditions that slowed decay would sometimes be exhumed months later, appearing strangely preserved. The corpse might be bloated from gases, giving the appearance of having fed. Blood might seep from the mouth due to pressure from decomposition. Hair and nails appeared to have grown because the flesh had receded. To observers who didn't understand the natural processes of decay, these signs suggested the dead were somehow still alive. Then there were the historical figures whose lives fed directly into vampire mythology. Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian countess who lived in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, became known as the Blood Countess. According to testimony from her servants during her trial in 1610, she tortured and killed hundreds of young women. The legends that grew around her case claimed she bathed in their blood to maintain her youth, though no contemporary trial records actually mention this detail. The blood bathing became part of the mythology later, added by storytellers who understood its symbolic power. Bathory's story reveals how vampire legends evolve. The historical person committed terrible crimes, probably including murder, though the exact number of victims remains disputed. But she wasn't drinking blood or seeking immortality. She was a noble woman who had the power and isolation to indulge sadistic impulses without immediate consequence. Yet within a few generations, her story had transformed into something supernatural, a vampire in all but name, because that narrative framework provided a more satisfying explanation than simple human evil. Another thread in the vampire tapestry comes from medical conditions that mimicked vampiric symptoms. Porphyria, a group of rare blood disorders, causes extreme sensitivity to sunlight, which can lead to severe burns and blistering. In severe cases, the gums recede, making teeth appear fang-like. Garlic can trigger attacks in some variants of the disease. Victims might crave blood-rich foods to compensate for their body's inability to produce heme. These symptoms, observed in an age of superstition and fear, could easily be interpreted as signs of vampirism. Rabies provides another medical explanation for vampire folklore. The disease causes hydrophobia, making victims unable to swallow and causing saliva to foam around the mouth. It creates hypersensitivity to stimuli like strong smells and bright light. It can cause aggressive, biting behavior. And it spreads through bites from infected individuals. A rabies outbreak in a medieval village would look very much like a vampire epidemic. People becoming violent, biting others, showing aversion to water and light, spreading the condition through their bites. But perhaps the most powerful contributor to vampire mythology was the simple, terrible reality of medieval poverty and famine. In times of extreme hardship, when crops failed and winter supplies ran out, villages faced impossible choices. Stories emerged of parents who abandoned children in the forest because they couldn't feed them, of travelers who disappeared on roads between towns, of bodies found drained of blood because in the depths of desperation, even cannibalism became thinkable. These horrors couldn't be faced directly. The human mind requires distance from such brutality to maintain sanity. So the stories transformed. The abandoned children became lost souls. The murdered travelers became victims of supernatural predators. The unspeakable acts of human desperation became the work of monsters. The vampire legend allowed communities to acknowledge the darkness around them, while displacing responsibility onto creatures that existed outside the normal moral framework. Across Eastern Europe, each region developed its own variant of the vampire myth. In Romania, the strigoi could be living or dead, and could send their souls out to feed while their bodies slept. In Poland, the upir retained many human characteristics and could walk in daylight. In Russia, the vampire legends merged with folklore about forest spirits and shapeshifters. Each culture adapted the basic concept to fit its particular fears and circumstances. What united all these traditions was the vampire's fundamental. It was death refusing to stay dead. It was the past reaching forward to consume the present. It was the person you knew and loved transformed into something that wanted to destroy you. In societies where death was constant and life was fragile, where plague could empty a village in weeks and war could destroy a generation in days, the vampire represented the deepest fear of all. That even death might not be an ending, that suffering might continue forever. So when Bram Stoker sat down to write his novel in 1897, he had centuries of accumulated folklore, historical figures, medical mysteries, and collective trauma to draw from. He didn't invent the vampire. He synthesized 1,000 years of European nightmare into a single, immortal character. He took Vlad's name, Elizabeth's aristocratic cruelty, the folklore of the undead, the fear of plague and premature burial, and he wove them together into Count Dracula. But here's what makes the vampire eternal. Every element Stoker used came from real human experience. The fear of disease, the terror of being powerless, the understanding that some people will do monstrous things when given absolute power, the knowledge that death surrounds us always. Dracula endures not because he's a fantasy, but because he's built from truths we recognize even when we can't articulate them. The monster in the castle is real. He just wears different faces in different ages. Vlad died in battle sometime in December of 1476 or early 1477. The exact date is lost to history, as are the precise circumstances of his death. Some accounts say he was killed by Ottoman forces, while trying to reclaim his throne one final time. Others suggest he was assassinated by his own men, nobles who had grown tired of his brutal methods. His head was reportedly cut off and sent to Constantinople, where Sultan Mehmed II displayed it on a stake as proof that the troublesome prince was finally dead. Even in death, he couldn't escape the method of execution that had become his signature. He was buried somewhere in Romania, possibly at Snagov Monastery, on an island in a lake north of Bucharest. Excavations in the 1930s claimed to find a headless corpse in royal garments, but the remains disappeared during World War II. Today, his grave is a matter of speculation and legend. Even his final resting place refuses to stay fixed in history. It's almost poetic. The man who became the immortal vampire has a death and burial shrouded in mystery. For 400 years, Vlad's story lived primarily in Romanian folklore and in the propaganda pamphlets that had circulated across Europe after his death. To his own people, he became a complex folk hero, a prince who had defended them against impossible odds and maintained order through harsh but effective methods. To Western Europeans, he remained a cautionary tale about the barbarism of Eastern lands, a monster whose cruelty confirmed their prejudices about the uncivilized borderlands between Christianity and Islam. Then, in 1890, an Irish theater manager named Bram Stoker began researching Eastern European folklore for a novel he was writing. Stoker had never visited Romania or Transylvania. His knowledge of the region came entirely from books, travel accounts, and his own imagination. But he was looking for something specific, a historical figure who could anchor his vampire story in reality, who could give his supernatural creature the weight of actual history. Stoker found Vlad's story in a book about Wallachian history. The name Dracula caught his attention immediately. It sounded perfect, exotic, and sinister without needing explanation. The historical Vlad's reputation for cruelty and his association with blood provided the perfect foundation. And his homeland of Transylvania, with its mountains and isolated castles, offered the ideal Gothic setting. Stoker took these elements and transformed them into something new. The Count Dracula of Stoker's novel bears little resemblance to the historical Vlad. He's not a warrior prince defending his homeland, but an ancient, evil, threatening Victorian England. He doesn't rule through political terror, but through supernatural power and sexual seduction. The novel barely mentions the historical prince at all. Yet Stoker's genius was understanding that the name alone carried enough dark weight to make his vampire feel real. Dracula wasn't invented. He was discovered, pulled from the shadows of history and given immortal life in fiction. The novel was published in 1897. It received mixed reviews and modest sales. Stoker died in 1912 without seeing Dracula become the cultural phenomenon it would eventually be. The real transformation came with cinema. In 1922, the unauthorized German film Nosferatu brought the vampire to the screen. In 1931, Universal Pictures released Dracula with Bela Lugosi, and the image of the vampire as aristocratic seducer in evening wear was burned into popular consciousness forever. Each new generation added layers to the myth. The vampire became a metaphor for everything we feared about sexuality, about foreigners, about contamination and disease. During the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, vampire stories took on new resonance as tales of transmission and forbidden desire. In the 21st century, vampires became romantic heroes, misunderstood outsiders who sparkled in sunlight rather than burned. The myth evolves because it remains useful, because each age finds new fears to project onto the immortal creature. But underneath all these transformations, the core of what makes Dracula terrifying remains the same. He represents power without accountability, desire without restraint, and death that refuses to acknowledge its own ending. He is the ultimate predator, evolved beyond human weakness, but retaining human intelligence and appetite. He is what we fear we might become if all moral restraints were removed. He is the dark whisper that perhaps immortality wouldn't be a blessing, but a curse. An eternity of hunting and feeding with no possibility of redemption or peace. And here's the strange truth. The real Vlad would probably have approved of his transformation into myth. A prince who understood the power of terror, who knew that reputation could be more effective than armies, would appreciate that his name still strikes fear 500 years after his death. He fought to defend a small principality that most people today couldn't find on a map. He ruled for perhaps 10 years total across 3 separate reigns. He should have been forgotten like countless other medieval princes whose names appear only in dusty archives. Instead, he became immortal in the only way humans really can, through story. Every film, every novel, every Halloween costume keeps his name alive in the collective consciousness. The historical man is buried and mostly forgotten. But the myth built on his foundation walks the earth forever, changing shape to fit each generation's fears, but never truly dying. This is power beyond anything the historical prince could have imagined. So what does Dracula tell us about ourselves? Why does this story endure when thousands of other vampire tales have faded into obscurity? Perhaps it's because Dracula sits at the intersection of everything that makes us human and everything we fear about losing our humanity. He lives forever, but cannot die. He has endless power, but is bound by rules and limitations. He was once human, but has become something else. He represents both the ultimate fantasy of transcending death and the ultimate nightmare of existing outside human connection and morality. The vampire myth also reveals our complicated relationship with power and violence. We condemn Dracula for feeding on humans, yet we're fascinated by his strength and influence. We root for the vampire hunters, yet we often find the vampire more compelling than his opponents. The historical Vlad used terrible methods to maintain order and defend his realm. We condemn his brutality while acknowledging that his world demanded brutal choices. The monster and the hero become difficult to separate when you look closely enough. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Dracula's myth. The line between monster and man is not as clear as we'd like to believe. Every villain is the hero of his own story. Every hero makes choices that someone else will call monstrous. Vlad the Prince became Vlad the Impaler through decisions that made sense to him in his context. Those decisions made him effective and feared. They also made him into something that could be transformed into an immortal monster by later storytellers. The castle still stands in the mountains of Romania, though it's mostly ruins now. Tourists visit and take photographs. The tour guides tell stories about Vlad and Dracula, carefully mixing history and legend because most visitors want both. The line between the real prince and the fictional vampire has blurred so completely that even historians sometimes struggle to separate propaganda from fact, legend from reality. But maybe that blurring is the point. Maybe the reason Dracula endures is precisely because he exists in that liminal space between history and myth, between man and monster, between the brutal prince who defended his realm through terror and the immortal vampire who haunts our collective nightmares. Both are real in their own way. Both tell us something true about human and the darkness we're capable of when circumstances strip away the comfortable illusions of civilization. Vlad died 500 years ago, but Dracula lives forever. The prince fought and lost. The vampire never loses because he cannot truly die. And somewhere in the shadows between these two figures, between the historical brutality and the supernatural myth, we find a mirror that reflects something uncomfortable about ourselves. We are not so different from either one. We are capable of both the cruelty that made Vlad infamous and the hunger for immortality that defines the vampire. The monster we fear most is the one we carry inside. If you found value in this exploration of the man behind the myth, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to keep this archive of dark history open. And let me know in the comments, was Vlad Dracula a monster shaped by his brutal world? Or was he simply a man who understood that survival sometimes requires becoming the thing you fear? Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? The candle burns low now. The shadows grow longer. But the story never truly ends. Until next time, sleep well. And remember that the darkest legends are built from fragments of terrible truth. This has been the archive of forgotten history.